Well, thank you all for being here. I see we've got 22 folks in the room already, and that's fantastic. Hi, I'm Val Stanley. I am one of the co-chairs of the Physical Samples Curation Cluster, and welcome to our session for the January 2023 meeting for ESIP. And today we're going to be talking to you about kind of an ongoing bit about what we need to continue with a project that we've got going for producing sample sharing guidance, and more specifically talking about citation and what that kind of looks like for this realm of things. Agenda for today, we'll kick it off with a few news items and updates, and then we'll kind of dig into some of the current recommendations and roadblocks with Andrea and Joan, kind of summarizing some things to talk about the state of where we're at. And then we'll go into some breakouts and work on a Jamboard to get your feedback on a few things, regroup, and that'll get us through 90 minutes. News and updates to share. First and foremost, everybody give it up for Chad Langtot, who's in the room here today. He is our first fellow for the cluster, and we're happy to have him here and looking forward to engaging with him some more in the future. Chad, if you want to say hi, go ahead, but if not, we can take care of that at another meeting.
Hey everyone, glad to be here. Thank you for the introduction, Val. I appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to learning everything you all have to teach.
Oh man, I don't know about teach. We're all learning together here. That's how I feel about it. Okay, so updates from AGU. There was a session with a lot of great things about sample citation and sample sharing in the FAIR data structure. And it was great. It was a Friday afternoon in Chicago, and we had probably 25 people there, which I would call a wonderful success, plus some folks online. And other outcomes of AGU. I got to speak with Brooks Hansen, who works in publishing for AGU publications, and he was very happy to have whatever guidance we had to share with him. So that's helpful, but we don't yet have a deadline from them. So some good, some bad. And then what else? Seems like we've got some involvement from the European side, some interest as from the EGU publisher potentially side of things, and a lot of desire to make sure that these guidelines are things that are more universally applicable, not just for AGU, but for other publishers as well. I think that's it on that.
Yeah, I can give a quick overview of the next update that we wanted to share. I'm Joan Damerow, by the way. I'm a scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab and a co-chair for this group as well. And we just wanted to mention that there is a new RDA group on complex citation forming, and they're currently in the review process with RDA, but they have a final version of a case statement, and I will put that in the chat in just a minute. So that's available, and something that's potentially relevant for what we'll be discussing in the session today. In general, the group aims to address use cases for citing a large number of existing objects, like data sets, software, or physical samples, in a way that allows credit for the individual objects to be properly assigned. And so this can include objects from multiple different repositories and online systems, and at like a single container of citations approach. And they're now referring to this as a reliquary. And physical samples are kind of listed as an emerging use case. So if anyone's interested in helping further develop samples use cases, you can get in touch with the organizers of that group, Shelley Stahl, Deb Agarwal, and Leslie Wyborn, or sign up to be part of the working group. And it is also a potential for us as a cluster to work through citation use cases as one of our next activities. So I just wanted to bring that up, and we can maybe discuss that a bit more later. And I'll put the link in the chat now as we, I think, move on to Kirsten, who will provide some CSAR updates.
Yes, and then backing it up a smidge, I forgot about housekeeping. You can see on the slide here, there's a meeting notes URL. And so I'm sure you've seen that in Kiko chat, but if you could all please sign in so we know all 25 of your names and where you're from, and who was here. And if you could all feel free to take some notes in there, we would deeply appreciate that. Okay, Kirsten, I'm going to pull up your slides.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just I mean, looking at the participants in the virtual room, I think there are a lot of CSAR users, and so I think it's appropriate to just give a brief update for those who are not familiar with CSAR. It's the system for a sample registration with services for sample metadata management, preservation, access. And what I wanted to talk about today, the update is about the role of CSAR as one of the allocating agents in the IGSN system. Would you just go to the next? Yeah, so most of you probably know that in 2021, the IGSN organization who has been governing and implementing the IGSN entered a partnership with DataCite in order to give the IGSN more sustainability and scalability as well. And with this transition come changes that have an impact on users. So first of all, the IGSN is now functionally a DOI. And all existing IGSNs that have been minted in the past will now have a DOI counterpart that is registered with DataCite, but the old numbers will all continue to resolve through a handle server that DataCite is still managing. And one of the impacts on users is that DataCite does require certain metadata. So CSAR will have to implement this in the coming months. If metadata are missing, the IGSN will be considered just a draft and will not be registered and searchable. And most importantly, I think, is that because there are changes to the syntax of the IGSN and becoming a DOI, any citation of an IGSN should include the handle prefix in the future. And if you can just go to the next one, just to explain that a little more. This is how the IGSN used to look, and you basically were just using the suffix as the IGSN. It resolved through either the DOI resolving service or the native handle service. And all IGSNs were sharing the same handle namespace of 10273. That has changed now. Can you go to the next? Whereby every allocating agent receives their own prefix from DataCite. The one for CSAR from now on is 58052. And so when you cite, obviously, you need to include the prefix in order to know where to resolve to. We're trying to implement short IGSN citations. We'll see how this is going. The new IGSNs, the registration service at DataCite just started on January 1. Can you go to the next? So CSAR basically stopped registering with the old system that was run by Kirsten at the GFZ in Potsdam. We had a brief interruption of a few weeks where we couldn't accept any new metadata, but we're now registering samples with DataCite and providing the new IGSNs. We're about to start re-registering all the sort of old IGSNs that we have in the catalog so that they will be transferred into the new DOI IGSN. We have our own, or we're in the process actually of AIDA getting its own DataCite account so that we can set up our CSAR repository independently and potentially also provide other repositories for interested organizations. But what this comes with is a new challenge for CISA in that IGSNs now cost money at DataCite, and we're going to have to implement some type of fee model. I don't expect that it will impact any of the individual researchers who register their samples, but larger organizations that register tens of thousands or even over 100,000 samples will need to share some of the costs. They won't be dramatic, but we have to come up with a solution here. I think that was it, or was there another slide? Oh, that's just, yeah, basically following up on, that we will in the future make sure that we distinguish more between individual users who register their own samples and organizations that basically have their own user base. And where CISA basically takes on the responsibility for managing an organization's metadata. But in some cases, that's actually not the case. The metadata is managed at the organizations and CISA just provides the IGSN. So we will create a better structure that that addresses these different roles that users will play in CISA. So that's it. And, ask questions. If you have questions to us, just send something to info@geosamples.org and we can start talking about the new structures.
Thanks so much. All right, moving on. Would someone like to introduce Dave?
I can do that, but Dave can do it himself.
Oh, go for it,
Because
Kirsten.
this is where I get to meet him for the first time.
I'll introduce myself. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Viglaeus. I work with the University of Kansas, and I'm also involved with CISA and the iSamples project. And I'm going to give a brief update on iSamples because we're very interested in this, in dealing with sample citations. And if I could I share my screen? I've just got a couple of slides to share.
Absolutely.
Yeah, hang on a second, Dave. I gotta give you the right permission. Just a second. Okay, you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so iSamples is, or the Internet of Samples. It's a National Science Foundation funded project to basically link together provide infrastructure to link together physical sample metadata and records. We currently have 4 use case collections covering anthropology, biology from the Smithsonian, archaeology from the open context, geological samples from CISA, and genomic information from Geome. But we're not limited to that, even though that's a diverse range of materials, we're not limited to that. Let's see. So the current situation is we have a prototype implementation that enables access to about 6.5 million odd physical sample records with metadata associated with them. The approach we're taking is mapping the metadata from the individual records into a common sort of simplified model that applies across all content. And we have based on those mappings, we have a couple of different control vocabularies, such as the sampling context, the sampled feature, and other things such as material type and so forth. And everything is visible in a spatial view and so forth. And we rely heavily, or completely, I should say, on persistent unique identifiers, resolvable persistent unique identifiers. And that's fortunate because it's very important for supporting citations, at least in a programmatic sense. So we've only recently started diving into supporting this concept of a reliquary, which I believe Leslie Wayborn is promoting, as among others. I'm sure there's several others. And the basic the notion of a reliquary is that it's essentially just a container of information, or relics in this case. And it's basically a mechanism or a document that essentially contains a list of identifiers plus a bunch of other information to facilitate reuse and repurposing and citation and representation of that information. Now, since iSamples is diving into this from a community perspective for the physical samples community, it is also really important that we engage with the broader community to make sure that our implementation ideally aligns with what fits with the broader communities. And likewise, I mean, if we're able to work with and help facilitate standards development on this line, we'd be more than happy to adopt those as well. We've come up with a few use cases. I'm going to point to these. I'm not expecting to go through all these right now, but I will mention that. So we've got like 11 use cases which cover the basic operations, such as, as an author, I'd like to provide record of all samples used in a publication. And then we've got some schematics on possible technical implementations to support that. After going through, there's about 11 use cases in here. I encourage people to look through those, comment on them, borrow them, take them, use them in other domains. I'm sure this is not an extensive representation, but I think it'd be good to leverage these if possible to facilitate discussion. The notion of the reliquary document really comes down to basically a list of identifiers. And there's all sorts of interesting uses that apply to that. But I'd also like to point out that it's also really important that the services of the infrastructure have in place some common mechanisms to enable operations on these reliquary documents. Even basic things like retrieving reliquaries, passing them, and interpreting how to access the referenced information within them. So it's not just a single standard for a document. It's also the supporting services, which I think are super important to go through. I think that's about all I wanted to say on this. I don't want to take up too much time talking about this, but I'd be happy to share, happy to discuss or accept comments or any feedback at all on these notions. So thank you.
Yeah,
Oh.
I just wanted to chime in real quick and say, we're going to talk about, I'm glad that you said this, that it's not just the identifiers, but also the set of services to support it, because that's something that I think we've been getting tangled up in a little bit when talking about this. And that's going to come up again in a couple of slides. So we'll have time in the big breakouts to talk about that if that's something people are interested in.
Before we get going, Andrea and Joan, there's a question from Madison Langseth.
Hi, yeah. So I think I'm a bit lost. Like, so do we have guidance on what these reliquary documents, how they're structured, or is that still something that is getting figured out?
That is still something that's getting figured out, and we're going to talk about what we've figured out so far in the next set of slides.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Am I supposed to be doing this part?
Al, I think you're muted. I'm not sure if you were speaking.
I was just saying, Andrea, go for it.
Okay. All right. So the next section, we're talking through our sample sharing guidelines so far. And it's both, we have some guidelines that we're pretty sure, we feel pretty good about putting forward. and also a lot of questions and things that we need feedback from the group and kind of some direction on where next to go. For those that are just joining this group, the too long didn't read version of what we've been working on is that samples should be cited. We need to provide attribution of samples so that people can find them again and reproduce studies, and also so that institutions can get credit for the use of the stuff that they're spending so much time and money curating. Our goal is to create guidelines in the vein of the AGU data citation guidelines for the citation of physical samples. Currently, we have a draft that's been getting worked on for about a year and a half. So Sarah Ramdeen was leading a lot of this effort. She wasn't able to make it today because she's having some troubles with basically Kiko chat or computer troubles or something. Or at least
I think Sarah is here.
Oh,
She
that's
is
great.
here.
Yes, that's awesome. Okay, good. That's excellent. So Sarah can chime in with history things too. So working on this for about a year. We've been like splitting up the draft into different sections and trying to finish those, but because it's a volunteer effort, of course, we're always like not making as much progress as we'd like. But between some meetings over the last couple, cluster meetings, and also talking through things at AGU, I feel like we're starting to, we're getting some momentum again to hopefully finish things up. So that's the current status. We have a draft, but we still need to kind of iron out what are the recommendations that we're making. Val, you can go to the next slide. So just some updates on where we are and some baseline things. We want to start off with just like, this is what we're using as a definition of a sample, because sometimes that's something that people want to talk about. And I think we're basing what we're calling a sample in the SOSA ontology. By samples, we mean physical subsets or extracts from some feature of scientific interest, for example, chips of rock, taxidermied animals, residue from some material created through a laboratory experiment. So it's a broad, casting a wide net so that we can hopefully apply these to interdisciplinary collections. Next slide. Our guidelines so far, basically, when you cite a sample, you need to include some metadata, whether that's metadata that's embedded in a bibliographic reference or metadata in a separate file. And we'll get to the different our questions around that in a second. But so far, we think that a reliquary or a metadata file should include sample identifiers, ideally that resolve to a web page with detailed standardized metadata, the name and location of the physical repository for the samples, if applicable. If the sample was destroyed, ideally you should still have an identifier, and we can get into that, but we should indicate that the sample was destroyed in analysis. It should also include links to associated data sets. And if there are associated data sets, those should also include sample metadata identifiers in them. If there's additional disciplinary metadata that different fields want you to include in a metadata file, then that should be driven by fields. You'd be following mix, or like following the standards that are developed for those fields, like Darwin Core or EarthChem templates. And that's about what we've got so far. So if there's one of our breakout questions, we want us to talk about like, is this enough to go into a reliquary? That's still kind of an open question. So in breakouts, we'll talk through that. But hopefully that's clear for now.
Yeah, I just want to chime in one thing, that it's actually not just the citation and reliquary, but just like general guidance. Like this document is just providing general guidance for people who are publishing on physical samples and related data.
Yeah. When we tried to get to specific guidance for what to do in journals, though, this is where we're starting to have some questions. So there's two main things that we're kind of working through still. First of all, there's currently no ideal place to store sample metadata when it is cited in an article, and we need help making a recommendation. It's also unclear what the best way to cite a sample in the text of a paper is. So to try to illustrate that, if you say you're using 5 samples in a paper, you could put that, have a nice sample metadata file. or a nice list of those samples that you're using. It's unclear if it's better to put them in like the references of the paper or in the acknowledgements section of the paper or in a separate file, because there's strengths and weaknesses to all of those approaches. So if you were to put that list of 5 samples with all that metadata in the table, in the text, that can be hard to mine if you're trying to actually harvest mentions of samples to build metrics or something like that. And some journals, now we're talking about making recommendations to AGU, and hopefully they would listen to us, but some journals have really severe page limits and might not be amenable to that. If we were to cite samples in references, so like creating an individual reference per sample, that's a little unusual. It's not a current practice. And from some of the conversations that Joan has had with one of the DataCite folks, it might not get mined in the way that we're hoping to. We might not actually be able to develop metrics from that. If we were to just include a list of samples that were used as an additional file, kind of like you use additional, like providing the data, backing up your, the data for your study, also including a sample metadata file. The challenge with that is that it's excluded from APIs and it's not machine accessible using current infrastructure. So that doesn't matter when it's just like a scientific data set, but for sample citations, we want to be able to show where they're being used and track that usage. If it's hidden in another file, it's going to be harder to get to unless there's a major change in that infrastructure. And that's something, Dave, where it'd be interesting to see, I don't know, talk about whether or not iSamples could be helpful for that. And then finally, in dataset metadata, if we were to include sample lists as part of the dataset metadata, that's a whole other list of different kinds of guidelines to develop. And same thing if we were to just throw it into the regular dataset metadata file or add it in with other study data. Again, it's hard to call that out. So we need to, I don't know, we still need to get recommendations from this group on which of these scenarios seems like the least worst and what further development we need to do in order to make it better for everybody that is trying to, you know, get credit for samples, track their use and things like that over time.
There are a couple of comments about including the persistent identifiers for samples in the publication DOI metadata as related identifiers from Kirsten, which does seem like the best practice, but I will say that it's not possible for some even for some repositories, and I'm not sure how to do that for publications. So Kirsten, could you say some more about that?
Sure. Well, I mean, it's obvious. Oops, no, I clicked again. It's obviously something that would have to be implemented on the side of the publishers, and that just attaching a file is ultimately not going to do it. And you know, the one of the purposes, I mean, this citation and credit and all that is findability, right? I mean, you want to be able to search across the literature and say, where are all the samples that, you know, the Smithsonian curated or whatever, based on unique identifiers. And if the identifiers and or, you know, sample names sit in some attached supplementary file, you're not going to find them. And so it needs another step. It can, where there are data citations, it can go through the data in some way, but you know, that doesn't always happen. We have a lot of examples where samples are just cited in the text and are not part of data sets actually that are attached. So
yeah, exactly. So that's why, like, for these guidelines, we were thinking that we need to provide some guidance to people, like using the current landscape of how things actually are right now, and then also have a discussion of what we would want to do ideally with like these other approaches like reliquaries, and like what we need to do with getting more publishers to recognize related identifiers.
Yeah, I think that at the moment the best recommendation actually would be to publish a data set, so to say, of descriptions of samples from a paper and get a DOI for that.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were thinking. And then like Andrea was mentioning, to include the list of identifiers in the data set metadata so that it's
Right,
searchable.
exactly. That's what we're already doing. I think Kirsten is doing that at GFZ and we're doing it in EarthCamp.
Okay, yeah, that's really good to
You
know.
find them, yeah.
So remember all that when you go into breakout rooms, and then write it down so that we remember and we can get the guidelines finished.
Well, can I just make a small comment on the same topic? The point is that Joan said you journals can't include this, but if you look what happened with implementing Scholix, they did exactly the same. They have already started to include all the cited papers in the crossref metadata to enable this linking between data and papers. So they can even take a similar approach. And to my, as far as I understood this reliquary, it is meant to do exactly that, to unwrap this collection, this reliquary, and to make sure that each item that is combined by the reliquary is included in exactly that metadata. I doubt that any citation metrics will go to the data set and then go further to see what related identifier they are. So we have to make sure to bring it in the papers somehow. But I think the reliquary is good, and they have talked I think they talked about it for at least 2 years, and they're now becoming an RDA working group, so we can all join and contribute. And this could be something that, for me, is success promising somehow.
Madison, did you have something to add?
Yeah, but maybe it's more in the weeds. Maybe we'll save it for a breakout.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so I'll move on to some thoughts that we have currently in the document on just guidance for assigning sample identifiers. And again, we're kind of right now like thinking about this in terms of like the current landscape and what's realistic, because this is guidance for AGU authors. And so we wanted to provide kind of an acceptable practice and a best practice if that seems like something that the group agrees with. And so in the document, we currently have an explanation of just general locally unique identifiers, and discussing this potentially as there are certain types of identifiers that would maybe be reasonably unique, but not a persistent identifier. And one question is whether or not we should list this as an acceptable practice, because there are going to be a lot, I guess, use of persistent identifiers for samples isn't widely adopted currently. So what should we do there? And of course, like we have outlined, the best practice would be to obtain a persistent identifier and a little bit of information on how to do that. And I think that in the document, we need to kind of flesh out a little bit more, have some more clear guidance for people on how they can get a persistent identifier. And so we currently have information about like obtaining one through your organization or through an external service such as CSAR, but I think we might need a little bit more details there. So people with some identifier experience, that would be good to have input there. And potentially adding some more updated information on obtaining persistent identifiers through their data site organization, or obtaining ARCs, or using identifiers.org. I think we need a little bit more information on how people can actually do that. And there's a description of some benefits of persistent identifiers and the importance of using these for provenance tracking and citation and use metrics in the future. And so our recommendations now are, as we were starting to discuss, were to include a list of all of the sample identifiers used in your paper, ideally the persistent identifiers. And it sounds like after Kirsten's update that we may need to update the format of that. So providing the standard format for listing persistent identifiers in the paper, ideally with a hyperlink if the journals allow it. I think AGU does. And then having a list of these identifiers in your data set metadata in a standard metadata file for these related published data sets that outline all of your sample metadata and data, and having those persistent identifiers in all of your data files. So that's kind of where we are right now. And we will have, I think there's a link for everyone to kind of contribute to that as well. And we'll have more potentially more discussion in the breakouts on this. Dave?
Yeah, hi, Joan. So you mentioned that assigning identifiers to samples isn't terribly widespread practice, and I'm just curious if you feel it's because the services for allocating identifiers are seen as hard to access or difficult to use, or if it's just a general lack of willingness to assign identifiers to samples.
I mean, I think it's both of those things, just depending on like who the audience is. Like, so, in some cases, it's if people aren't using like I guess samples that are held in long-term collections, it may not be needed or considered necessary to get a persistent identifier, and maybe it's not, unless like we've done a lot of work on use cases for these kinds of like samples that aren't held in long-term collections, and our use cases involve these really interdisciplinary data sets where we need to link a lot of related information, and so persistent identifiers are really useful for that. But a lot of groups don't really know what persistent identifiers are in that sense. There's I guess a lack of knowledge about what they're for, and that they even can apply to samples for some groups that aren't involved in the informatics community and collection.
Yeah, I wanted to chime in, just be like one case that I think of. I think about like where I used to work, the La Brea tar pits. Like they use these would essentially be a Darwin core triplet, which is like the collection code and an identifier, but they don't have a PID in the way that we're talking about it. And the issue would be like if I was using a fossil there, I wouldn't want to assign an identifier to that fossil that they hold because I'm not the curator of that record. So I think there's still some permanent natural history collections that are not assigning PIDs because they just don't have the support staff for it. And it also requires major organizational change that'll take like 4 years of discussion for them to decide to do.
Yeah, and just chiming in, I represent a library of seafloor sediment samples at Oregon State University. I mean, it's a work in progress for us to get this implemented and get all those identifiers set up for the collections that we have, and then samples that we give to users, providing those identifiers to them and impressing upon them how to use them in a publication is like a whole, it's another step.
Madison, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, I guess I will, to play devil's advocate a little bit. I think that a lot of these places are not going to prioritize getting PIDs unless there's unless the publishers are saying you have to. So it's almost like if you put in that it's acceptable not to have one, then we're never going to see that culture shift and that change and like that adoption, because nobody has to do it. I think we saw that a bit with data. You know, now that publishers require that you have a DOI with your data, you know, for your data, researchers and organizations are figuring out how to get them. So we might need to kind of go through an uncomfortable period to kind of actually force that change.
Kirsten?
I think what can help is that, for example, IGSN as a PID for samples is included in the DataCite metadata schema as related identifier type. And I was talking to Andrew Houghton, who was chief editor for Scientific Data, and I was asking him about his ambition to allow sample citations. This was already in 2016, and he mentioned that many of these samples, of these identifiers for physical objects, were very long, very short term only. So they existed for a couple of years or for 5 years, then they disappeared. But when I told him that IGSN is included in the DataCite metadata related identifier types, he was very attentive. And I think this could be a way of how to get more visibility for the individual PID. And then, because you can put it in the metadata, people might get more motivation for that, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I guess in the interest of time, we should move to the next. So I just have a couple of slides on to give a little bit of background information that might influence some of our recommendations for citing samples, because we do have a section on that, on citing samples in our guidance, and we still need to kind of fill that in. So next. I wanted to, I had this slide, this is from an AGU presentation. It's kind of like illustrating some potential, like we have been discussing, using related identifiers to link samples and to data sets and publications. Like this isn't, I guess, current practices. There isn't infrastructure doing this now, but this is kind of illustrating some of the metadata that we would need to do that. So you can use standard connection metadata to help track use and citations of samples, as we've been discussing, and it would be needed for both credit when samples are integrated in new analyses or work in the future, which is, again, especially important for natural history collections to track credit, and also for tracking use and links to relevant resources, and to illustrate like how this would be done. You can click again, click through. There's some animations here. So you may have a set of source material sample records that are used in a data set, and the data set contains a sample metadata file describing the samples included in the data set. And if the samples have IGSNs or another PID, then the source material record could be updated as being part of of the data set with a link to the data set. So it's just using the related identifiers with also metadata on the resource type, which would be the sample, and then a relationship type, which would likely be is cited by. And you could ideally like propagate all of those is cited related identifiers that have the is cited by relationship type back to the source material records. That's kind of like our thinking as we're working through some of our use cases for linking related samples and data sets. Next slide. And so I recently got just a little bit of information from the samples community manager from DataCite, Rory Edmonds, and maybe Kirsten knows a little more about this and can add to this here. So I just, in an effort to figure out what we might need to do to eventually get metrics for samples. So a DataCite, again, would be one of the key players that could be able to provide the citation metrics, at least from the perspective of citations of samples in data sets. So for a citation or a reference to be recognized, it must be added as a related identifier, as Kirsten mentioned, in the DOI metadata for the paper or data set. Also, as we heard earlier, IGSNs are now DOIs. And so metrics for use of sample DOIs will be available in citation metrics. But my understanding from what he was telling me was that it's currently only recognized at an allocating agent level and not at the individual record level. So currently it's not possible to filter out metrics on citations for samples, but it could be in the future, and it depends on the feedback that as they're going through the next data site metadata schema and soliciting feedback on that. And I think we'll have to be in a position to provide feedback and advocate for needing certain metrics as we see that need. Next. So yeah, Val, do you want to, I don't know if we have time for questions now or if we want to get into our breakout groups, because we're
at about 1:47. So let's see, we wanted to leave some time for breakouts as well as wrap up and discussion, right?
Yeah. And Kirsten, if you want to add anything about the metrics, if you know anything else, I'm not.
No, I mean, it's unfortunate, but that's the situation, that basically these IGSN DOIs are not recognizable at the individual level as being a sample identifier. And I think, you know, groups like this should really advocate for the necessity of having that functionality. I had advocated strongly for that, Kirsten did as well, but it got postponed in the discussion, so to say. So I think it's really important that the samples community makes it clear to DataCite that this is a need in order to create the metrics that this community needs.
Great. Oh,
I
Kirsten?
just want to add one sentence, and I think it's not only the metrics, but it is also the metadata we are using for describing samples. And if I was part of this metadata group to make the transition, the mapping from the IGSN metadata to DataCite, and so far we have used only the mandatory metadata, which are very different to what we usually use for sample metadata. And I always advocate for using the IGSN metadata schema, although it was never fully acknowledged by all allocating agents. But I really hope that we find a means to keep our rich metadata for describing samples and rather map like a summary of them to DataCite to be findable in the new system, but still have the richness and the appropriate description of samples.
I was recently looking at the DataCite API and their metadata schema, and the API works with their JSON in serialization of the DataCite metadata. And if you go and look at their JSON schema for the DataCite metadata and the examples in there, they do some really interesting things, because unlike XML, JSON is an open world. They actually include identifier types and other fields in there beyond DOI. And so I think it would be entirely possible to serialize something like our iSamples metadata scheme or some kind of generic sample scheme using the JSON metadata. The question is what I don't know is how much of that DataCite is indexing. And this is something that would be well worth exploring with Rory, and to find out what they're actually doing on their side with those JSON metadata documents.
Well, I have asked some these questions in the metadata group, and they said they don't even index the translated titles and everything. So I think for purposes of performance of the search index, they rather do not include any odd thing or any new thing. But it's an interesting comment on the JSON. It's definitely worth looking at.
Dave.
Dave, anything to add before oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add. My response is already covered. Thanks.
Okay. Well, all right. So introducing our breakout activity. There's going to be 3 groups, and each group will have 3 Jamboards for 1, 2, 3 of these topics that you see in front of you right now. So your first board will be about current recommendations for sample metadata and identifiers, with some prompts to help you think through some of these scenarios that we were talking about before with best practice versus acceptable practices, for instance. The next one will be on functional requirements for sample citations, trying to get some more precise things from you about what sample citations need to do. And then the third one for each group is what tools and infrastructure are needed to support citation and attribution metrics. What we're hoping that each group can do, it's 1:52 now. So Joan and Andrea, I'm thinking we could turn people loose for 20 minutes and then have roughly 10 minutes for discussion and then 10 minutes for wrap up.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Sounds good. Cool. So there'll be a link if someone could drop that in the chat. And then I also have the next slide has it. And you'll see that there's 9 boards. And so group 1 can take care of boards 1, 2, and 3, and then 4, 5, and 6 for group 2. And then 7, 8, 9 for the last one. And so we'd like you to tackle as much of these 3 topics as you'd like and what your group is interested in. And then it would be great if you have a note taker and a reporter so that when we come back, we can hear about what did you have consensus on and what was hairy and scary and a topic that needs more work. Anything else?
I'm having trouble accessing that link for some reason.
It should be anyone with a link can edit.
Yeah, confirming that it is. Madison, let's try to just share it with you personally and see if that helps.
I think I got it. For some reason, it just clicking on it didn't work. I had to copy and paste it. Thanks.
All right, so I have the 2 rooms that I'm going to send some folks off into, and then there'll be a group that stays here. If you have any questions, just come back to the main room and we'll figure it out. And I know breakout rooms are scary for some people, but just do your best. Any contributions are welcome. Ready to go, Val?
Yes.
Okay. And then for those of you who are still here, you're group 3, you're just in this room.
Okay, so I guess we're room 1 then. Wonderful. So I'm happy to turn everybody loose to think about this and work quietly for a little bit before we discuss. But I did just want to double check that everybody in here knows each other.
I don't think I've met any of you in person. I know many of your works, many of your plural works, but I'm a student at UNC Chapel Hill in the School of Information and Library Science, and my background's in geology, and I've just sort of been a lurker with ESIP things, and I'm lurking today. I actually wrote a paper about the iSamples schema, so that's fun. For a class.
Oh, that's very cool.
That's
awesome.
Yeah. So I've seen you in video recordings before, but not.
Hey,
not
can we get a
live.
copy of your paper?
Yeah, I know, right?
Oh gosh, no. You're putting me on the spot.
When you're ready. Well, thanks
Yeah,
for
yeah.
taking a step out of the shadows, Zoe.
Yes,
Anyway,
I'd love
hi.
to see it.
So we are supposed to put our ideas into that Jamboard?
Yeah, so we were just trying to segregate things so it didn't get too crazy if we had everybody adding to all the same Jamboard for each of the topics. So that way we can look at just like what we were talking about.
Are we group 3 or group 1?
I think we're group 1.
Okay.
Let me hop into the Jamboard. I've got my screen full of all the other things. Okay, yes. Looks like group 1. So slides 1, 2, and 3 are ours.
So how do I write in there? the sticky note. The sticky
Yeah, the stickies are
note.
great.
Okay.
All right, I'm lost. Where's the Jamboard? I was
Oh,
not paying
here.
There
attention.
was a link in the chat, but I'm also lost. I can see it, but I can't do anything. No worries.
Okay. I just added another link in the chat.
Thanks.
But still, that is there, and we. Ah.
I think we said I would do this part. We've got 15 minutes left, right?
Yes, go for it.
Do you want to bring up the Jamboard actually?
Oh,
The Jamboard.
yes, that's a much better idea. Second.
I think while that's coming up, well, basically what we're going to do is go through group by group and maybe like in 2 minutes, tell us like if you came to any strong opinions about recommendations we should make or things like that. Yeah.
Yes. All right, here we go. Yes.
Group one.
Group one. Okay, so people had a lot to say and there was a lot of furious typing silently. But we got a lot of good content in here. And people who got smart and added double stickies to make their comments longer. Smart. I took a tour through here and I think there's just a lot of really great specific advice here on all the topics. And I really love that on topic 2, people really attacked the idea of credit and what that would take for a sample, because I think that's something that we need to put together. So all of this specificity is greatly appreciated.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah, and lots of good stuff talking about how to link things together for topic 3.
Awesome. Anybody want to chime in and share specific opinions that you want to make sure we all hear? If not, we can move on to group 2. Okay, I was in group 2. We only got to this topic and we spent a good bit of time talking about it, but I felt like it was really helpful. The places we landed, we think since we can push AGU to do something with these guidelines, I think we suggested pushing them to provide a list of identifiers and metadata, the metadata that we recommend in the data availability statement as an actual table and not just as a supplementary file, but also to include that as a supplementary file as well, because why not? We also started talking about how we need to draft a position statement to AGU and DataCite. So we've been talking a lot about we're writing instructions for authors, but we also need to write instructions for publishers and for DataCite, kind of like a position paper saying this is what our community needs. And so part of it for AGU is like, I think it was, I forget. Natalie had said she published a paper with AGU and they stripped out the links to her IGSNs. Don't do that. So I think making recommendations like that would be helpful, and also talking about what is the metadata that DataCite needs to be harvesting. Like, not to make more work for us, but I feel like that's where the guidelines are kind of splitting. Like the authors can only do so much. We need to tell these groups what to do. As far as identifiers, we talked about requiring PIDs at publication as a way to push the field forward, but I'm a broken record about this, but I think we need to think about like, how do we support collections where there's like one collection manager keeping a SAT database together and they do not have time to take care of the stuff and actually assign PIDs. So making sure that we have an on-ramp for that somehow, either through making it easier to register stuff one at a time, or giving people like okay, fine, use Darwin Core triplets because that's all you have. But, And I think that was the main thing that we talked about. We talked about some challenges with PIDs, but I don't have to go into that. So that was the core of what we did.
Great.
So group 3, who is in group 3?
So I was in group 3, and we had kind of a similar conversation as group 2. We did talk a little bit about really like leaning on the benefits of using PIDs for samples to kind of help alleviate some of the need to have more standardized metadata, and whether or not we can do that now, like in the current landscape, or if we should still be recommending more information with the like fully describing individual samples in data sets, for example. Like we should be considering more in our guidelines, like how we can leverage when people have used PIDs and with the standard metadata. But there wasn't, like, I guess, a strong opinion within our group about like we probably do still need to have like a section on acceptable practices for just providing reasonably unique identifiers and a little bit of guidance on how to do that.
Yeah. I love that our field has been talking about identifiers for approximately 20 years.
Let's see, was there anything else someone wanted to bring up about that? We talked a little bit about the next topic, but not too much.
Awesome. I think since we only have 7 minutes, let's talk a little bit about what our next steps are. The first one, of course, is to finish writing up these guidelines, but also just making sure we're coming to consensus to what we're recommending. I'm wondering if anybody has thoughts on how we can keep making sure we're pushing towards consensus or getting to something that at least a fair number of people agree on.
Wonder, I mean, looking at the comments on the whiteboard, it seemed like there was a lot of convergence on what people were saying in the 3 groups. And it seems like that might be one way to start thinking about, okay, these are the convergent things. But maybe I didn't read things carefully enough. I don't know. I'm just didn't.
Yeah,
you have some data there.
I would agree with that. And one thing that we could do is kind of use these comments to keep updating our draft and then circulate that around and also discuss it in some of our next cluster meetings. But like, do we want to set a deadline for doing this? And
I think what you notice is probably that if you want to have consensus, you can't go too much into details. There will be always, a disagreement on certain things, and maybe it's a start to, as Steve said, to look at the common, look at the agreements that are there and start from there. And then see if, you can create a document that can be open for comments and suggestions.
Would folks broadly agree? It sounds like, yeah, putting in a metadata file as part of the paper, but I don't know how much other groups talked about this, but like put in a structured list in the data availability statement if AGU will let us. Does that sound like something like a good step to include?
it could also be in the methods. I think a lot of people put information about their samples and methods.
I think the thought with the data availability is because it at least puts it in a consistent place.
Like a table of some sort that would just be.
Yeah, I mean, that was my suggestion, that, you take a table data set, which is a data set. It's just basically a descriptive data set and not numerical numbers from analyzing the samples or so. And you just publish that. You publish it just the same way the data set is published, and it gets its DOI, and it's a citation. And it becomes, accessible that way. It's in a repository where it's persistent and persistently accessible. It, through the repository, it will go through a curation review. So I think, that's it's a good possibility.
Yeah, so I guess what we were converging on was having it in somewhere listed in the paper so that it could be mineable. Like if people are doing literature reviews using, like, I don't know, text mining approaches, they could find papers that are related to certain samples and data sets. So what would be the requirements for that? And I think that would be including a list of the samples in the paper itself, in data set metadata, and potentially in a data set metadata file.
Based on the work that I've done trying to do that, putting it in one consistent place in the paper would be ideal, which is just because it winds up getting scattered. So it could be materials methods, but data availability might be an easy place to push on, just because that doesn't count towards the word count of the paper.
And you have to take into account that in some cases there can be, 1,000 samples.
Yeah.
So one of the things in that table might be a link to a reliquary.
Yeah.
Right. Which is sort of, yeah.
I would also add that systems that are indexing the publications should be smart enough. They're not now, but they should be smart enough to recognize an identifier in the text and follow that identifier and see what's at the other end. And if it is a reliquary document, then continue to expand on the content referenced in that document to augment the metadata associated with that publication. And that's the way the indexes should work. It should take advantage of these persistent identifiers that are referenced in a publication, because that they reference information that's pertinent to the publication. And so it's not just the content in the documents, it's the systems that are able to take advantage of those identifiers and traverse those links to get that information. That's super important.
Are there certain groups that we should be talking to like start moving in that direction?
Sure there are. Publishers for one.
iSamples.
Anybody that's index, iSamples is a big group to talk to. The publishers, DataCite, anybody that's indexing publications, anybody that's indexing any documents with identifiers in
them. Okay, we got 1 minute left. Sign up for our listserv and please join our monthly telecons. I think we'll keep pushing on the guidelines, but it also sounds like there's a need for like a position statement. We've talked about this a bit in past meetings too, but I think we should try to push to get the guidelines as done as possible and then move on to a position statement, maybe where we can put all of our rants about the tools that we need and that don't exist. Which is my favorite form of ranting.
But we've got all these wonderful stickies now that we can assemble. So it's great.
And Abby, point taken about connecting with GBIF. I think that's a good note. Yeah. But everybody, thank you so much for your participation and for coming. This is great. We appreciate your time and your smart thoughts.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks. Great to
Thank
see you all.
everyone.
Yeah,
See you all tomorrow. The sessions start tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern. See you there.
Thanks for coming, Kirsten.
Kirsten, sleep well.